Right, this question here is all about looking at trig graph transformations and how they appear when we do it. Now remember, when we talked about trig graph transformations, there were a couple that were available to us. We had, if we were looking at just sine, it could be y equals a sine of bx plus c plus d. If we were to look at it specifically being cos, it would be a cos of bx plus c with a plus d. Now remember, every single one of them had a different effect on the curve, and each of them had a different effect on how it would look. So in this case, the a's would stretch it or squash it in y, the b would stretch it or squash it in the x direction, the plus c would move it left or right, and the plus d would move it up or down. So when we get given an image of a curve like this, we have to be able to look at it and say, right, what transformation has happened and how has it transformed. So this time we're told that we have y equals cos of x plus a plus b. We have to figure it out. Now the first one to look at is the plus a, partly because that's part a, but also because that will have the first effect on the curve. Now what we need to do is realise that that plus a is moving it left or right in the x direction. Now we know the maximum for a cos curve starts at 0. We also know the minimum for a cos curve starts at 180. What you'll notice is the maximum, which occurs there, has moved from 0 to there. The minimum, which normally occurs at 180, has now moved there by the same amount. It's moved up by 1 notch. Now we need to figure out what each of these notches is worth. Well, if you look at them and count them, one of those movements is 30 degrees. So what that means is the curve has moved to the right by 30 degrees. Now, a big thing to remember is that x does the opposite to what you want. So it's moved up by 30 degrees, which is fine, but brain wants to tell us that that would mean it's plus 30. However, what you've got to remember is that because the x does the opposite to what you want, the value of a isn't plus 30, it's actually minus 30 degrees. Essentially what it's saying is, for the curve, we look 30 degrees back the way, and we bring that up, and that becomes our new value at this point. And that's how it transforms the graph in such a way that it's actually the opposite in terms of the sign. So that's the first transformation. That's for part A. Next one wants to state the value of part B. Now remember, we said B involves a curve going up or down. So what we need to do is figure out how it's moved. Now if you think about it, the original curve, the highest value, the maximum of cos, was at 1. The minimum of cos was at -1. So in this curve, what I've done is I've taken my maximum, which used to be at 1, so here, and I've moved it up to there. I've taken my minimum, which would have started off the bottom of the graph down here, and moved it up to 0. So I've moved the minimum up from -1 to 0. I've moved the maximum from 1 up to 2. What that means is it's moved 1, and for this one, the y actually does what we want it to do. So instead of like the x, we do the minus, what we're actually going to do is state the value of b as being b equal to 1, because it's moved every single point on the curve up by 1. So a question like this, you have to make sure you know how the transformations work. These are the possible transformations that we're going to be looking at this stage. These are the possible transformations we've got. So we need to learn how each of those affects it, how they affect it differently, and what order we look at them, and how we approach it from there. Now this question, each of those will just be a mark for you being able to recognize the transformation and recognize how much it's transformed by. And if you can do that, if you can remember how each of those transformations work and how they affect it, and how to get them by looking at the graph, you'll find this type of question no problem. It'll be relatively straightforward, easy peasy, lemon squeezy.